Welcome to Pakistani Writings in English. Today's discussion is actually a continuation of the topic I started last week. If you remember, in that discussion, I talked about the criteria to determine which writers and which works are to be included or excluded from this subject. Secondly, I introduced you to two generations of Pakistani writers, mentioning only the most influential ones. I concluded that discussion guiding you about some of the most common themes explored by these writers. So these were the 3 points on which my discussion was based. Today I want to take it forward and complete it, because as we'll be studying different Pakistani English novels, I want you to understand the issues I want to focus on and explore at great length. So this discussion will provide you a good amount of critical ideas to develop your own mature understanding of these texts, so that you may not only be receiving ideas but also be able to produce your own, and that is a huge purpose. So today I'll be talking about Pakistani English novel and why I'm focusing on novel instead of other genres, and then I'll talk about the issue of representation of Pakistan by these writers in their works, and secondly, how their representation of Pakistan by these diasporic writers has been received by the native readers. So let's first of all look at Pakistani English novel. I have selected novel instead of poetry, drama, prose, autobiography, memoirs. Although all these genres have been attempted by Pakistani writers, but I have chosen to introduce you to Pakistani English novel for two reasons. The first is my own choice of various Pakistani novels for my discussions, and secondly, and more importantly, because novel has been the most dominant genre of Pakistani literature in the last 2-3 decades. And once I explain how novel as a genre has been the most influential platform to explore different issues of importance, you will be able to realize how important or more important novel is than other genres. Now, novel has become not only a form of literary pleasure, because the principal aim of literature is to provide you with aesthetic pleasure, but at the same time, novel has come to serve a very serious intellectual purpose in modern day society, and this is true of Pakistani English novel as well. it has been one of the most appropriate means to create liberal democratic environment in multicultural societies in general. So novel is not merely about writing a story. Rather, it has very important content at its heart, which needs to be understood and analyzed by the reader. So these stories in the form of novel carry a huge social and political importance for the reader. And Pakistani writers wrote this literature because they wanted to use literature and especially novel as a platform to express their own national belonging, their own views and ideas on different aspects of life, especially in relation to what is happening in the world around us. So it is no longer a passive reading. The writer writes with certain baggage of ideas which he wants to convey through this novel to the reader, and then the reader is expected to respond to these ideas depending on his or her own understanding. So writing and reading novel or literature in general has now become a very serious intellectual exercise in itself. And in Pakistan, novel has become a novel of ideas. You must have studied Ibsen's drama, which was called Drama of Ideas by people like Bernard Shaw, because at that time in Victorian society, when Ibsen's drama became popular and recognized, it was noticed by people like Bernard Shaw. And I'm referring to Bernard Shaw because he wrote a treatise talking about Ibsen's drama, Quintessence of Ibsenism. And then Ibsen became so influential that his drama was emulated and imitated for its stagecraft and dramaturgy by other dramatists, especially Bernard Shaw. Similarly, in Pakistani context, the novel has become a novel of ideas. It is not merely a passive and art for art's sake activity. Rather, these writers treat novel as a serious platform, providing them an opportunity to conduct a sort of dialogue with the world around. So these writers wrote to make sense of all the chaos around in the context of Pakistan, and also to bring about an understanding of the unique nature of their country to the West. So I'll be talking in detail about how Pakistani writers are in a difficult position while writing. on one hand, they are talking about the stories of Pakistani people, but simultaneously they know that there is a huge Western readership for their works. So, how they manage this problematic position is a matter of investigation, and we'll be talking about it in a while. So, this was it on Pakistani English novel, that it is the most important genre used for contesting, questioning, and addressing certain issues which are of immediate importance for the writer and his readership. So, the two aspects of representation I have just outlined in the beginning, let me rephrase them to make them understand these ideas better. The first is representation of Pakistan as a society, by which I mean how these writers talk about the history, culture, and contemporary geopolitical issues of the country. How Pakistan as a country stands in this global world, apart from exploring some important moments of their history and culture. Second aspect of representation is more complex. Here we move beyond the writer. We have the writer giving a certain representation to the country through their works. But now the problem is, and this is what is experienced and expressed by readers from Pakistan, these writers who are currently living abroad, how far can we rely their and trust their representation of Pakistan, because they are not living here. So the readers assume it is not possible for them to represent Pakistan the way it deserves. So they have their own reservations, and these reservations are grounded in certain reasons, which I'll be elaborating on in a moment. So first of all, let me talk about the issue of representation of Pakistan in Anglophone Pakistani literature. There are these four aspects of representation which I'm going to talk about, and I want you to explore them further on your own. The first is Pakistan's origin and the issue of partition. These writers have reflected on this huge moment in the history of the subcontinent when India was divided into two countries by the Britishers. Now, apart from this division, partition caused communal tensions, mass massacres, large scale migration, and homelessness and rootlessness because the people who left their birthplace found themselves at the mercy of no one. They had to live in refugee camps, and you can imagine the kind of precarious future these people had. And this actually happened on both sides of the country. Those who were living in the territory now declared as Pakistan, if they belonged to Hindu religion, they migrated. And similarly, the Muslims who were living in the territory which was now declared India had to leave for Pakistan. So this mass migration caused a lot of social problems. So some of these writers have talked about the experience and stories of those who were involved in and suffered from this partition. See, here we are not dealing with the question whether partition was a right political decision or not, because although Hindus and Muslims and many other ethnicities and communities were living together in this part of the world for centuries, when the time of British departure from India came near, now it became increasingly evident for the Muslim minority in comparison with the Hindus, and this was an argument put forward by the leaders of Muslims at that time. If the Britishers left and did not divide this country into two, it meant that the Muslims were, even after their departure, slaves to Hindu majority. And you know, at the start of the century, the relations between Hindus and Muslims had undergone a significant change. Even if they survived peacefully together before these nationalist movements started, now there was this sentiment among the people identifying themselves as different and distinct from each other, and thinking that now they would not be able to live together peacefully. These nationalist movements made people aware of the difficulties that they had to face if they would live together. So these differences, although sometimes are dismissed, but they were too strong to be simply ignored. So the Muslims, under the leadership of their prominent politicians, advocated for a separate homeland of their own. If you look at Liaquat Ali Khan's speech that he delivered when he visited United States of America after the creation of Pakistan, he clearly argues that this partition this division of the country was not solely based on religious differences. The Muslims and Hindus were historically, socially, and culturally quite poles apart. And the argument that I have just offered, that the past was past. Now, there was a political campaign going on for the departure of the Britishers. There was this Leave India campaign. And if you look at history, since the Muslims were not very educated, at least not majority of them were exposed to modern education, and they were not very prominent in politics of India. On the other hand, Hindus were. So the Hindu majority was being represented by their leaders. And in some elections, we notice how the rights and concerns of the Muslims were dismissed, were not faithfully, sincerely represented by the Hindu politicians. So the Muslims at a certain point in this nationalist movement changed their perception of peaceful coexistence with Hindus. And even people like Qaid-e-Azam and Sir Sayyid, who earlier advocated Hindu-Muslim coexistence, and they believed in cooperation between the two peoples, had to change their mind. And this is where the Muslim minority were represented by the Muslim leaders, and then ultimately it led to the creation of Pakistan. The point is, after this national consciousness in Hindus and Muslims, it was no longer possible for the Muslims to expect cooperation and fair treatment from the Hindu majority if they would choose to live under their political rule. Now, coming to the exploration of issue of partition, we have many writers who explored this issue in their narratives. I have just mentioned 3 of them. Bapsisidwa's Ice Candy Man, published in 1988, is an eyewitness's account of the cataclysmic events of partition. This novel was later entitled as Cracking India. So this is a narrative that offers a detailed exploration of the experience of partition. And then we have the 2 works which we'll be studying in detail: Wajahat Ali's The Domestic Crusaders and Farooqi's Between Clay and Dust. Now, in The Domestic Crusaders, we have the character of grandfather Hakim or Hakim, it can be pronounced either ways, who has been involved in partition communal riots, witnessed killing of his own people, and then felt compelled under this mob sentiment to somehow take revenge of his loved ones who were brutally slaughtered by other communities. And this, experience of partition and then Hakim's involvement in murder of these people is considered very significant by his grandsons, especially Fatima and Ghafoor, and they actually associate the current chaos and mess in their lives to this experience, this involvement of Hakim in those killings. So somehow they believe the blood that Hakim carries on his hands has its psychological negative effect on the psyche of on these characters. And then we have Farooqi's novel, Musharraf Ali Farooqi's Between Clay and Dust, published in 2011. So the novel is actually set against the backdrop of partition. The story actually takes place in 1950, 3 years after partition. And the story revolves around two traditional artists of that society, pre-partition society. A professional wrestler, Ustad Ramzi, and a traditional courtesan, a woman of Kotha. Now, in this narrative, Musharraf Ali Farooqi focuses on the social impact of partition on the lives of these two traditional artists. These two who were part and parcel of pre-partition society, where they were sponsored and financed by Nawabs and Rajas. But when the society changed its structure, now the same people find themselves out of place, as if they have lost home, because they are no longer in their familiar circumstances where they were valued. So if you look at Wajahat Ali's The Domestic Crusaders and Musharraf Ali Farooqi's Between Clay and Dust, there is this significant difference in the exploration of partition issue. Wajahat Ali's play refers to the psychological trauma and wounds which were left by partition on the people who were involved in this nerve-wracking experience of losing home, witnessing your loved ones to be slaughtered before your eyes, or even taking active participation in this chaos and killing other people. On the other hand, Musharraf Ali Farooqi's novel talks more about the social impact, the social effects, the social aftermaths of partition, how it changed the life of the people, Ustad Ramzi and Goharjan the courtesan. The second aspect of representation of Pakistan in these narratives is Pakistan as a patriarchal society. Patriarchal society is society in which father is the head of the family, and this society is male dominated society. So this is actually based on empowerment of men against women. So some of the narratives have explored the issues of women, how they are ill treated, marginalized, and exploited by males in society. Here I would recommend you to read something about feminism in Pakistani context, because there have been movements in which women actively participated and voiced their concerns openly. Now, in this context, I have mentioned two examples: Babsi Sidwa's novel The Bride and Tahmina Durrani's Blasphemy. So, The Bride is actually exploration of how the major female character Zatoon, who significantly once again loses her family during partition and is adopted by another man, Qasim. Once she is of marriageable age, he marries her off into the family of his brother in a tribal area. And then Zatoon's marriage with Sakhi, her husband, has its many problems typical of a male dominated society that treats women in an unfair way, exploiting them. So in that novel we find how Babsi Sidwa also significantly highlights temperamental differences between city dwellers and people of tribal areas. Since Zatoon is brought up and raised in a city where people are flexible and their approach towards values is comparatively relaxed, and when she is married off to Sakhi and goes on to live in a tribal area, these people have some sort of rigidity in their temperament. Here we find Babsi Sidwa talking about how land itself and circumstances, the area where one resides, has certain influence on one's temperament. So she refers to how the rocky terrain of these tribal areas make these men strict and inflexible. So this narrative explores Zatoon's plight and problems in a patriarchal society. Second example I have mentioned, Tahmina Durrani's novel Blasphemy. Now, this novel, although the name refers to showing irreverence towards religion or some of its aspects, talks about how a religious peer, a guide who claims to be the descendant of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, marries a much younger woman, and then this woman, this girl who is from a poor family, goes to live with him and discovers the hidden secret horrors that the peer is committing under the under the cover of his religious piety and his religious reputation and his a lot of his followers. So basically, this narrative again explores shocking details about how these evil people who portray themselves as pious and religious actually exploit their position. And since in this novel, the novel focuses more on the plight of a female character, that is why I have mentioned it under this aspect of representation of Pakistan as a patriarchal society. The third aspect of representation is Pakistan as a Muslim majority country, and the writers have talked about their politics, religion and culture. And in this category we have many novels. If you go back to the previous discussion on Pakistani literature in English, and where I have talked about the common themes explored by these writers, you'll find how those ideas actually fall under this category of politics and religion, culture, history. So that is why I have not mentioned any examples here. Now, coming down to an issue that is explored in detail about many Pakistani writers, and it has been very influential, very important, shaping and changing the politics of the world, is 9/11 attacks, when Twin Towers were attacked by terrorists. And after that we have a cataclysmic change in the world at large. Especially there was this surge of hatred of Muslims in USA, and this issue has been addressed by many diasporic writers, because as we'll see in these examples, the Muslims living in those countries were living as well integrated and good citizens of the country before 9/11. And even the treatment of these diasporic Pakistanis or Muslims before 9/11 by Westerners, by whites, by Americans and Britishers, was fair enough. These immigrants were owned as part of the country. There was no discrimination against them. But when 9/11 happens, there was a huge change in the attitude of the state towards its Muslim immigrants, and consequently in the attitude of the natives towards the diaspora. And as we discuss Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist in our coming discussion, I'll talk about how state propaganda was very effectively used to arouse this anti-Muslim sentiment at that time. And the population of the West was not harboring any grudge or enmity against the diasporic Muslim community. They were living peacefully together. But in order to, and this is a point that Stephen Morton has made in his book, and I'll mention the reference of his book in our discussion on the reluctant fundamentalist, that this approach by the state was adopted to justify their own foreign aggressive policies towards different Muslim countries. Now 9/11 attacks were soon followed by this surge of Islamophobia, and then the world was haunted by issues of terrorism and fundamentalism. And this decade became a decade of violence, whether it was state violence or violence by terrorist groups. So these issues have been addressed and explored by Pakistani writers in multiple narratives. Here, for the sake of introduction, I have just mentioned three. First of all, The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid, in which we have this main character Changiz, who migrates back to Pakistan after 9/11, and then if we go by the form of the novel, we find, as the novel starts, Changiz in conversation with an unknown American listener. And here, during this monologue, which was actually supposed to be a dialogue, conversation happening between two people, but since all the conversation, all the talking is done by Changiz, and the American, who is not identified till the end of the novel, does not respond, especially verbally. So this narrative explores Changiz's experience living in America as an immigrant, and after 9/11, the discrimination that he experiences, his sense of alienation and unfair treatment by the state and the people who were actually made frightened by of the Muslims, who were portrayed through media as potential terrorists. So this surge of Islamophobia, and here during my discussions I'll reference some of works by a leading critic of American US foreign policy and a very influential linguist, Noam Chomsky's works, and how he analyzes the unjust and unjustifiable approach of US state towards other countries whom they declared terrorist and attacked them and bombed them. So this media manipulation is one of the main arguments in Chomsky's works, where he talks about how democratic states, in comparison with totalitarian states, depend on exploiting media in order to control the population and their opinion. So, here, change, this drastic change in people's attitude towards Changiz and similarly other Muslims in these other works is due to the visual representation of the Muslims in media, which portrayed the Muslims as potential terrorists. So at that time, when chaos prevailed and people's judgment of fair and foul became blurred and clouded, the Muslim became equivalent to terrorist. And that is why you have this Bollywood movie, My Name is Khan and I'm Not a Terrorist. Because in those times, even having a Muslim name was enough for a person to be discriminated. And he was insecure and state was no longer considering him a respectable citizen of the country. So this state propaganda actually led to this change in people's attitude towards Muslim immigrants in USA especially and other European countries after 9/11. Similarly, we have exactly the same cases in Home Fire, written by Kamil Ashamsi, and Home Boy by H.M. Naqvi, in which, in Home Boy especially, we have three well integrated westernized characters, but since they are originally Muslim by their birth, by their faith, and their names suggest this identity. See, for them, this is all about their identity as a Muslim. In practice, they were not orthodox Muslims or even extremists. They were not, you can say, practicing Muslims. But, and the way they found themselves comfortable in that society at that time. They identified themselves as New Yorkers, as if they were originally truly part of the country. And they go to bars, drink, and do everything that is or that can be characteristic and representative of Western culture. But despite that, even this sort of immigrants who were by origin Muslims found themselves in a very difficult situation where life became too difficult for them. They were maltreated by people, they were bullied by them, attacked by unknown people. People called them names while they were walking in streets, and even they are taken as potential terrorists by the police department. So all these narratives are actually aimed to make the West realize the unfairness of treatment of these Muslim immigrants. whose Muslim identity became more important than their practical life, in which they had truly uh, adopted their lifestyle and adapted to the circumstances around them. They were not resisting their values. They had actually started practicing them, and not somehow to make themselves part of the society, but this is how they felt comfortable. But it became increasingly difficult for them to survive respectfully in that society right after 9/11. In brief, so far I have talked about the first aspect of representation, the first issue of representation, how Pakistan as a country has been represented in these works, and then obviously experiences of different Muslim immigrant characters in the writings of these diasporic writers. In my next discussion, I'll be talking about how the representation of Pakistan by these diasporic writers is contested by the native readers. So, I'll be analyzing how far their reservations against the unreliability of these representations is solid, or their reservations are strong enough, and then we'll try to create a balanced approach on how to view the representation of Pakistan by these diasporic writers. So, see you in the next class. Thank you.